The main US negotiator, Todd Stern, asked in Copenhagen what he thought about climate debt. He said very simply, that sense of guilt or culpability or reparations, I just categorically reject that. And that was a way to say to one of the main demands of sort of a polluter's pay argument, very simple principle of neoliberal economics. No, US interests come first. And thank goodness for Bradley Manning, for Julian Assange, because we know so much more about what Todd Stern and his assistant Jonathan Pershing, what Hillary Clinton, what Johnny Carson, the US Assistant Secretary of State, has been up to. Because in February 2010, the main African Union leader on this topic, his name's Meles Zenawi, he's the tyrant of Ethiopia, has killed hundreds of people who have been protesting for democracy, and has a really, really firm grip on civil society. I was there a few weeks ago in Addis, and it was just a chilling experience talking to the NGO crowd. They were just very, very nervous. But we learned from WikiLeaks that in February last year, he more or less sold out to support the Copenhagen Accord, which all the African heads of state said, this is just not going to work for us. And it was in exchange for financial benefits for Ethiopia. Ethiopia, of course, had been given George W. Bush's permission to go and invade Somalia in 2007, and is seen as a reliable ally of the U.S. And just in July, just bought $100 million of Ukrainian tanks. So this is a very unpleasant regime in Ethiopia. And this is even more poignant in a way when you want to get into the power politics of negotiations. Do you remember seeing these men wearing their scuba gear as they were preparing for Copenhagen to dramatize that their state was sinking? That's the Maldives cabinet. Does everybody remember? Quite an evocative moment. So we again learned from WikiLeaks that in February 2010, the government of the Maldives, for $50 million, sold out and made a U-turn and supported the Copenhagen Accord, which assures their island will sink. So this is the kind of blackmail and bribery and corruption that's just totally embedded from U.S. State Department. It leads us to ask, should people like Todd Stern be encouraged to come to Durban, or should they be discouraged from coming in view of their systematic, demonstrated sabotage of climate negotiations? So having answered that question, footsec, that's the South African word you normally say to your dog, like, fuck off, get away. Our protests at the U.S. consulate have been ongoing there. Hillary Clinton even shows up. So we have a sort of little pressure on these U.S. folks, especially because of the Keystone XL pipeline and the solidarity with the 1,250 people arrested in late August, early September, and a few thousand out there again on Saturday. So we look at South Africa being connected into that circuitry of U.S. power. We don't quite know what the new international relations and international cooperation of our foreign minister, Maite Ikwana Mashavani, is giving to Hillary, but she seems very happy to be getting whatever it is. So you should know that the president of this COP, she's actually the chair of the conference of the parties to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. We just call it the Conference of Polluters, so just for short, the COP. And we are worried because a couple of incidents demonstrate her commitment on climate. One was that she didn't want her handbag to be x-rayed at the Oslo airport in early September, so she just said, no, I'm not going to do that. And they tried to explain, but only like kings and queens can go through that without having to be x-rayed. Everybody else has to be. And she said, nope, here's some old convention, and so she just stormed out, and she came back and got a private executive jet to fly her to her next destination, Bulgaria. So that was a $30,000 bill and a bit of a bigger carbon footprint than necessary. A second incident is a little more worrying if you again think about the power politics and who's got whose thumb on which politicians, because she basically denied a visa to the Dalai Lama just to come to Archbishop Desmond Tutu's 80th birthday. I mean, it's really absolutely embarrassing. So we just don't quite know which Beijing or Washington, which thumb she's going to be under for the COP17, but watch that space if you think anything useful will happen inside. Okay, the argument from the South African delegation is that they are worthy hosts, and they are now trying to say we've got a new white paper and climate policy, and we are interested in a mitigation and low carbon future. But in fact, at the moment, we are building in South Africa the third and fourth largest coal-fired power plants in the world, called Medupi, which the World Bank gave a $3.75 billion loan for last year, and Kusile. And we're building a huge petrol refinery that's actually earmarked for Venezuelan dirty crude, like tar sand type of crude. And we have a climate white paper and a green paper before it, so that basically will leave the mitigation to the provincial and municipal. And this is worrying because in the host city for the COP17 Durban, we have a new Academy of Science of South Africa, ASAP report, arguing for a low-carbon city. But what we understand by that is just utter greenwashing, because we're seeing a whole set of projects open up for Durban, which, as I say, is the second largest city, 3.5 million people, including the widening of the port, Africa's largest port, and a brand new port that's planned where an old airport used to be. So we have a new airport. It was built simply for the World Cup. It cost over $1 billion, and a new Dubai trade port next to that. A reliance for economic development on sports tourism. Did any of you watch that World Cup as it was unfolding there? So we had quite an interesting debate about what that was all about. We can come back to it if you like. And a bid to host the 2024 Olympics is in the offing with white elephant stadia that shouldn't have ever been built. And the expansion of the petrochemical complex, where in South Durban, I'll argue there's a huge backlash brewing against the COP for the reason of these kind of regular fires. And the doubling of the oil pipeline that goes from Durban to Johannesburg. So we're seeing a variety of high carbon activities, which this COP is allowing us to now put into the public sphere in such a way that even the government now is beginning to wake up and say, okay, this is South Durban, especially a big problem with this big petrochemical complex. But we basically would look at South Africa's role in this politics as the way, if you all remember during apartheid, here's Henry Verwoerd describing to the World Bank, IMF, WTO, how they did it then. And these places were called Bantustans. Do you remember the old Bantustans? They were homelands for the low-income, particularly black women, whose role in the reproduction of male labor power was cheapened that through the systemic approach of capital and pre-capitalist relations. And they needed Bantustan elites. They needed guys like, most famous was called Gacha Bubelezi, head of Inkatha of Kwazulu. And the question is whether, in fact, South Africa is playing that Bantustan elite role in a kind of global climate apartheid by polishing the chains of global apartheid. A phrase, by the way, even Thabo Mbeki used regularly. Polishing them rather than breaking them, to use Archbishop Tutu's phrase. And one indication is the Green Climate Fund, which is terribly important because it's the largest fund ever, $100 billion a year. And it's co-chaired by the finance minister until 2009, Trevor Manuel. Now he's the planning minister, but he was the longest serving finance minister. And he's so respected that when that, what was his name, French, Dominique Strauss-Kahn, we don't want to talk about him, but when he had to go, this guy, Trevor Manuel, nearly became the number two, well, it was basically the number 2 third world candidate. The Mexican central banker Carstens was the first candidate, but he really should and could have taken over had there not been this big Euro crisis that was, sort of required a new French finance minister, corrupt though she may have been. But the $100 billion isn't enough by all accounts. I mean, we're seeing the damage in Pakistan from last year's flood at $50 billion, and large sums of money due, in a sense, by what I can go into more detail about, if you like, the climate debt that the North owes the South. One of the key arguments from southern governments and from civil society to get that sort of north-south flow going. And the problem is giving to this Green Climate Fund means we probably will see more money going to the likes of Mala Zenawi and more money going to Ukrainian tank purchases or other repressive measures that we think most of these tyrants in sites that are particularly vulnerable to climate change will be using the money for rather than properly funding it, sending it to poor people. So we have argued for a basic income grant mechanisms in areas affected by climate to make those north-south climate debt payments instead of going through the corrupt aid agencies and the whole bureaucracy associated with aid. We're worried that private sector-led false solutions will be funded with that $100 billion a year. We also worry, of course, they won't even get anywhere near $100 billion, and that they'll try to get the money out of the carbon markets to revive them. as a sort of set of techniques of subsidizing those markets with leverage from the public sector. That was what the World Bank promoted at the G20 meeting in Cannes last week. They had a paper that came out in late September arguing for a variety of funds to keep these carbon markets going, and the Green Climate Fund to say, well, let's take half or even more of our revenues from the carbon markets of the North. And then finally, the question of whether the guy in the bottom right, Robert Zoellick, President of the World Bank, is the appropriate person and institution to be the trustee of this world's biggest fund. Now, there's talk that he'll be replaced by Hillary Clinton next June or so. If not, I'm just going to give you a little sense of how dangerous this is, as appears now. It's the World Bank lending $6.3 billion in the last year for fossil fuels, up from $1.6 billion under Zoellick's command. And this endorsement, especially of the huge loan to South Africa from Medupi, is a prime example. Their promotion of commodity exports is a dogma that never ends. Their promotion of corrupt resource-cursed economies. Their promotion of carbon trading. These are the kinds of things that give us a sense that you just cannot see the World Bank as a trustee of such an important fund. But even if you go into Zoellick's own qualifications, which I just like to do because I did a little biography of the fellow. So he became the World Bank president in 2000. You'll forgive me, this isn't very academic, I know, but it's interesting to say, well, what is the character of global governance? What is the caliber of the world elite today? And I think you'll agree it's not very high. Wolfowitz, his predecessor, fired for nepotism. He was at Goldman Sachs, like in charge of like their top international banker, and that wasn't so healthy for the world economy, was it? And then he was U.S. State Department #2, and that didn't do so well for the Bush regime's image abroad. And then he was U.S. Trade Rep during the WTO's crash. I think you all know that the WTO used to be this really formidable threat to world democracy and to people's livelihoods, but it basically fell apart in the Cancun meetings in 2003 because Zoellick couldn't cut any deals because he was so brazen and arrogant by all accounts. You know, this is a little known fact that when James Baker needed to count votes, he needed somebody to really manage that process in Florida so that people with darker skins wouldn't be counted. So that was Robert Zoellick. And then he was a senior political advisor to Enron. And he was also an original co-signatory to that letter in 1998 of the Project for the American Century. Do you remember that letter? What did it say? Invade Iraq because of the tight connection between Al-Qaeda and Iraq. Do you remember what those connections were? That tight connection was the letter Q. They couldn't find any other connection, but that was the kind of caliber of the sort of research that you get from Robert Zoellick. Before that, he had an idea called a subprime mortgage, and he was #2 at Fannie Mae. They also went bankrupt, of course, so that wasn't a very good period. Before that, he was the top presidential, second in chief of staff to George Herbert Walker Bush, just before Bush Sr. lost the bid for re-election, so that was also another little failure. And at U.S. Treasury, he was in charge of the State Department, the Treasury's his assistant secretary for financial institutions during the S&L crisis. So, like everything he does, like this is just his, like the main things in the CV. I'm sure there's lots more. He uses breaks. So I could go on to Dominic Strauss-Kahn, but I'm going to leave that aside. This is just to say global governance since 1987, right? Montreal Protocol on chlorofluorocarbons to stop ozone hole. What can you guys say here in New York, at the UN, or anywhere in the multilaterals has been effective? Yeah, I thought so. There's absolutely nothing, right, that you can say global governance has done. So what we're so worried about is that taking this wonderful idea of climate debt and giving it to men like Trevor Manuel, I can do a whole bio on him if you like, in my new book, and Zoellick, will mean we are going to see the carbon markets boosted and false solutions. We can talk about what those are all about, finance and private sector beneficiaries. And the things we really need is a transformation of our society and our economy and environmental reforms of a huge transformative character, and they're just not going to be funded. The basic income grant to make sure that the people really adversely affected would get the benefits of this huge climate debt fund. So we just fear that instead what's going to happen in the UNFCCC is what always happens, where the national delegations are going representing their capitalist classes, their fossil fuel industries, their heavy industry, and that just means they just want to emit more. This is our great cartoonist Shapiro trying to pick up that sense of, wow, this is a structurally flawed system, UNFCCC. So if anyone disagrees, if anyone hears from the UN and would like to say, no, it's got a lot of integrity, this process can work, you're going to have a hard case to make, and Durban's going to make it harder because the Kyoto Protocol will die. I think Durban will be known in climate the way Oslo is in the Middle East, betrayal, inefficiency, incompetence, and just total failure. So what we're trying to do is to hasten that process and fast forward by delegitimizing the COP17, and I'll tell you what the social forces in Durban look like to pull this off. It's not going to be easy, so we're going to use some tricks like playing cards. You might have remembered George W. Bush used these when he invaded Iraq to get people to know the 52 playing cards. So we're going to kind of have a set of clubs and big spades, big companies that are doing extractive industries, and then of course heartburns, that would be the government officials who break our hearts. And so if you have any ideas who should be in our top 26 people or top 26 companies and institutions, please let me know. We're working on various other ideas for this kind of culture jamming and logos, and that slogan's originally from Acción Ecológica in Quito, leave the oil in the soil, the coal in the hole, the tar sand in the land. And did you say that you're working on fracking? Fracking's important here. Who's the poet in the house who can help us with fracking shale gas? Somebody said, leave the fracking shale gas in Mother Earth, but you can decide if there's a better one for that. Here we've got the official logo, which is a baobab tree. This kind of funny old 100-year-old tree, all dried out, wonderful old specimen, and it's on top of what they describe as a deflated earth. So the sort of attempt by the artists in the South African government is to capture a sort of desperately dry tree that's just kind of alive through, who knows, and it's basically all bark. So we're trying to figure out what kind of jam on that logo works best, maybe turning it upside down in front a little bit, or letting the vultures start eating it up. So this is the sense of how we're going to work on, also beautiful, more positive sensibilities for the logo jams and for our own slogans. The official South African government idea is to working together, saving tomorrow today. And it's a very banal line that you hear all the time now on the radio. In reality, it's warming together, stealing tomorrow today. So our artists and our graphic folks are having a blast. And hopefully we'll also have the kind of creative protests and various kinds of activities. We also have nice beaches like they did in Cancun to illustrate how the COP17 is really a conference of polluters. Some say it's a conference of procrastinators. I don't know if any of you in the House would say that, but we don't think eventually they'll get around to it. We don't think they'll ever get around to it, so we're saying conference of polluters. Now, it's a hard terrain to work on, so I'll shift now to the local politics, because we are starting from a situation where South Africa, amongst major countries, is the second least conscientized on climate, so after China. And so we do have some big problems in just raising the consciousness, and we haven't been very successful. Here's some of the techniques. The first, out of about 5, I'll just run through, or 4, I think I've got 4, would be to demonstrate again and again, as Mother Nature does, that there is a serious problem with weather and weather patterns and extreme weather events. So this is just one example of a beach, Manzantoti, that just got, all the sand just got washed right out of there. And that's the sort of sense we have of major storms. This was in 2007. And of course, on the beach, the rich whites live, but it's also, of course, the poor low-income folks in the shack settlements that are going to be perpetually most adversely affected, most vulnerable to the extreme weather. So that's happening a lot. It was very evocative in August because a huge oil tanker swept up onto the shore in Durban, and 400 tons of oil were stuck in that oil tanker's hold and about to break up on the rocks, and would have created a sort of Exxon Valdez type of mess in one of the nicest areas. So they had to work really hard to get that ship carried away and the oil pulled out. Well, the second of our consciousness-raising exercises has been to get into the connections between climate and local grievances. And the most obvious is electricity. This Eskom is the 4th largest power company in the world, a state-owned company that's commercialized, and is putting up prices dramatically on poor people. And the reason is because it's still giving the cheapest electricity in the world to especially big smelters run by BHP Billiton from Melbourne, Australia, which was formerly Gencor of South Africa, and also Anglo-American, now out of London, but formerly, of course, the major South African company, the major company in Africa. And they were getting the cheapest electricity. To give you a sense, their special pricing agreements were even lower than what Eskom was bragging about. In US cents per kilowatt hour, 2 cents was the average that they were able to lock in on a 40-year apartheid era deal because of something I know everybody in the US can relate to, corporate control of the government. US style crony capitalism of revolving doors and big corporates buying up the government officials. And I can go into the details if you want in the big case of Beatrice. So we've been trying to get these kind of corporate deals broken and exposed. And so there's a big struggle for rights of access to information that's captured the country's imagination. And this is one of the major cases where the big fat cats at Eskom have been for many years in bed with Beatrice and Anglo to give this cheapest electricity. And so one of the ways in which that came to the surface was through this World Bank loan that was the biggest loan ever for a project. World Bank's made $3.75 billion last year. And to give you a little bit of a sense of an extensive set of arguments, we said there shouldn't be a new coal-fired power plant when BHP Billiton and Anglo get the benefits and poor people will be priced out of the market. World Bank said this is a poverty pro-poor loan, but in fact when these price increases are hitting poor people. Most importantly though, we are in fact in South Africa with coal-fired electricity 20 times more CO2 emissions intensive than the United States, measured by per unit of per capita output, to give you a sense of the energy intensity of the economy. And the Medupi coal-fired power plant will be the fourth largest, the Kusile is the third largest, and that'll be probably some 30 million tons of CO2 equivalents per year, which puts that one company ahead of 115 countries. And it will lead to these huge increases for poor people to pay for this huge new coal-fired power plant, plus the next one, into the foreseeable future of 25% a year. So that's generating massive protests because of especially the disconnections that are occurring in the townships. So electricity is becoming just so expensive that people are reverting to illegal connections, and the illegal connections are in turn being addressed by municipal officials coming in and cutting illegally connected lines. That has been the basis for a major outbreak of new protests, the service delivery protests. We have been demanding from those townships an increase in the free basic electricity, which is currently, for those who qualify, they do means tests, 50 kilowatt hours per household per month, which is just a tad, tiny bit here. In fact, I think, is that one of the subjects of your study over at Hunter, right? At City. Okay, so we do have from CUNY a major study, right, about these protests and why people are so angry. So Mrs. Kumalo, for example, in Soweto, rips out her prepaid electricity meter and joins a big march and dumps it at the city council. And a third, in fact, of the Eskom direct customers have zero electricity consumption, indicating that they've been disconnected and they're therefore illegally reconnected. And you'll get that sense of the extraordinary lengths to which people are going to keep the electricity when there's real warfare going on in a place like Durban. eThekwini, Durban, ratepayers are losing, that's roughly $15 million a year to illegal electricity connections and cable theft, and the municipality has admitted it's losing a war with shack dwellers who steal council cables and hot-wire power connections. On Friday, shack dwellers in a place called Kennedy Road threw rocks and packets of feces at council contractors and security guards who disconnected illegal connections and confiscated stolen cables. The windscreen of a security vehicle was shattered, guards fled. Last week, security guard Wiseman from Benny was shot dead in nearby Sika Lake in a row over illegal connections. So we're really seeing this exceptional sort of anger and grievance and defense of the illegality of electricity connections, service delivery protests. They feel like, if you know that phrase, IMF riots, that were very commonly described in the Third World over many years, and those protests popping up all over at the world's highest rate, pretty much. I mean, China has a bit of a higher rate now. They're very, very competitive in protesting and everything. And so the protests are just formidable. At least 8,000 a year that the police are picking up in their records. Now, getting those protests to more explicitly address the problems of Eskom not doing renewable energy and having excessive prices for poor people and excessively cheap electricity for these big companies and for rich people is the ideological orientation that we obviously hope would bring together the red and the green, the workers, the communities, and the environmentalists. So there are struggles to find that confluence of a politics that would be uniting. I think the most hopeful is what you'll find as a major report issued in the next few days at www.climatejobs.org.za, which is a million climate jobs campaign to try to get those metal workers, for example, to move out of the big smelters, where there are very few jobs, 1,700 in the biggest complex at Richards Bay, and to get into constructing a huge new set of solar hot water heaters instead. And so this is partly taken off from the million climate jobs. And here in the US, there haven't been so many as effective initiatives within labor, but here in New York at Cornell, they've got a very good project there with John Sweeney and some of the others that are working on it. So that was the second. The third is consciousness-raising strategy to evoke a local politics that brings climate to the fore would be the attempt to highlight the damage of fossil fuels. So I'll give you a sense of this. It's very evocative for me because just exactly a month ago today, we had 100 school kids hospitalized in one of the schools quite close to where I live. It's in a place called Merebank. And that's because, as the reporter put it, the 100 primary school students taken to hospital, some struggling for breath, others with itchy skin and eyes after being splattered by airborne droplets of crude oil and a cloud of smoke and soot from another fire at Engine. So Engine Refinery is what you see going up in smoke there. And so that's what it looked like on October 10, is it just yet another big fire, which in fact has shut that part of the refinery and cut off liquid petroleum products that go to restaurants. Natural gas from liquid petroleum was what was being done in that particular complex of Engine. Engine's an 80% Petronas-owned, Malaysian-owned firm. And then the next night we began to see the mobilization. So this is in the very same school where the 100 kids were hospitalized from, called Settlers Primary. It's an interesting school because it was recorded about 10 years ago, and it hasn't really changed, as having a 52% asthma rate, which is the highest ever recorded in any school. So this is because it's right next to the huge refinery complexes, one on either side. One owned and operated by BP and Shell as a joint venture, and the other by Engine. So that, if you put those two, SAPREF, BP Shell, and Engine together with a third up at the top of South Durban, next to the port, you've got the biggest complex in Africa, but more petroleum refined there than anywhere. You've got the biggest Toyota, and the biggest, in fact, car assembly plant in Africa. You've got the biggest paper mill in Africa, in South Africa, right here, Mondi. You've got the biggest complex of petrochemical plants also here in South Durban. We've got the biggest port in Africa, and another huge port where the old airport was that will cost about $30 billion. And we've got huge problems of container terminals, and especially the freight traffic that comes from them in residential areas of South Durban. So this means this whole area of South Durban is an exceptional laboratory for community resistance and labor community struggles, sometimes in unity, sometimes not, with a very strong radical environmentalism. Our best environmental justice and the anti-environmental racism movements have come here. This is where the African townships are, so the prevailing wind will often blow the pollution right up into Umlazi and Lamontville. This is the Indian area, the area that was especially affected by the huge explosions. It's right here. That's the Settlers Primary School, and this is the so-called colored area called Wentworth, and it gets into lower income, middle income white areas just a little bit further along called the Bluff. So it's a fascinating area that I hope all of you will keep an eye on, because I think it will be the basis for, we've got some incredibly good political movements that have come out of there. A Goldman Prize winner, Goldman is a sort of progressive environmental award, Bobby Peaks, Des DeSales, one of the leaders there. And so you see, sort of cheap by jowl houses and this huge refinery that keeps blowing up. And it really does blow up, like regularly, like every 6 or 9 months, one of these huge conflagrations occurs. And on top of that, since you all are fracking experts here in New York, we're getting from Shell a major fracking challenge across South Africa that's just started, and there's been enough of a fight back in this area from conservationists and wealthy whites actually, so that this area has been declared off limits for the next 18 months for a moratorium. But the frackers still want to come all throughout here, including in the area not too far from Durban, which is where we have the most beautiful mountains, the Drakensberg Range, so that's full of potential fracking shale gas exploration. And on top of that, we've got this massive fossil fuels belt. Now, Johannesburg is right here, and not too far from there is Sasolburg. And Sasol is the biggest single emitter in one place in the whole world, in its Secunda plant, which is where they have a coal to oil, now a gas to oil conversion plant. And if this continues to pick up as a technology, you can imagine all the coal fields in the world being used to squeeze out drops of petroleum. And this is such an extraordinary CO2 site. So this whole Vaal area is being very, very hotly contested as a site of environmental justice struggle. If we come down, there's this huge big pipeline that's just doubled in size. And here we have in Durban, not just the refineries, but something even more dangerous, I think, which is exploration offshore for petroleum. And who's doing the exploring but a firm from Burma that's tightly connected with that Myanmar junta. And that's something that our Free Burma Coalition has been fighting. It's in the news quite a bit just at the moment. Another site where Durban interrupted the COP is very embarrassing. Unfortunately, even under Nelson Mandela, who did recognize the Burmese junta as a legitimate government in 1994, unfortunately here in the UN, South Africa is seen via its the thumb of Beijing as a strong ally of that most horrendous regime. Well, a fourth area, if I can depress you yet more, is the biggest landfill in Africa, which is what you're looking at. And some of you might have heard of Kennedy Road, which is the shack settlement where the group Abishali Basmati has been based. But I'm going to focus actually on this house here, because that's where the woman who started struggling against this huge landfill lived, Sajida Khan. And this landfill was put there in 1980 by the white municipality, and it was Indian, low-income African, colored, mixed-race people. So they just said, okay, well, we'll just put that big dump there because it's convenient to some of the highways to get the huge 4,000 trucks a day to offload their rubbish here. And the municipality was supposed to close it. The ANC actually campaigned in 1994 saying we'll close this because it is such an explicit environmental racist case. But they didn't. In 2002, the World Bank came and said, no, don't close it. Let's just fill it up even more and suck out all the methane and burn it and turn it to electricity in the biggest African methane to electricity transfer. They've got 6 big turbines, which are now located down here, that are funded by the Clean Development Mechanism of Kyoto. The Kyoto Protocol, as I mentioned at the beginning, when you get a little bit of the film's story of cap and trade, sets out that the CDM, Clean Development Mechanism, allows big companies in the north to overpollute and just buy the right to do so ultra cheap, like for 14 euros per ton for the methane that's seeping out of this big landfill. And the price today, I think it's around about 8 euros a ton, a little bit less. We've just been crashing it. So it's really an ineffectual market mechanism to address the problem. And this is the sort of prime case of carbon trading. Sajida Khan died in 2007 because of cancer that she got in her second dose of that from that dump, living across from it. It had hazardous facilities and medical waste incinerator. And as I say, the CDM went ahead, but she made such a case against it. The Washington Post put her on the front page the day that the Kyoto Protocol came into effect in 2005, and it was really seen as an extreme case, so the World Bank had to back away from it and wouldn't support it. But they are still very much involved in the other methane to electricity CDMs in Durban. So we did from that, basically because of Sajida Khan, we did get the opportunity in 2004 to host a Durban Group for Climate Justice, which is a wonderful network of technical folks. Michael Dorsey here from Dartmouth, but lots of others from Institute for Policy Studies, from Friends of the Earth International, a group called the Corner House, where Larry Lohman was the main editor of this wonderful Dark Commercial Foundation Development Dialogue issue called Carbon Trading, which I think has had about 1 million downloads. It's a phenomenal book that really gets into all the details of what's wrong with that. So lots of good grassroots activists from around the world and progressive northern technocrats. It's a very nice model, the first, I think, real solid network of climate justice activists. Well, back to Durban, what we anticipate based on a lot of protests that we've already seen this year and a lot of international solidarity. This is the Goldman Award winner, Bobby Peake, and that's Trevor Ngwani. Some of you may have heard of the film Two Trevors Go to Washington. And he's a main Soweto organizer, and he also just finished his master's degree with us. So we have some tremendous climate justice organizers and activists. But it is a fairly small group. I mean, in the whole scheme of things, probably less than 100 can really be said to be up on the issue and active. And if we look at the entire process in which CJ has arisen, and I don't know if we want to go through that in any detail, but Michael Dorsey and I wrote an article in an Australian journal that kind of goes through a lot of detail about the emergence of this movement. We would certainly say that labor is a missing element, and the anti-imperialist project, and maybe now the challenge is to get the Occupy movement sensibility. Just today there was a big new website on the scene called Occupy Cop, so let's see where that goes. But we definitely would at the same time acknowledge interesting contradictions, especially the emphasis that is placed in some of the CJ circuitries on the insider baseball game, right? The sort of interstate diplomatic negotiations. And some of the groups that do this, like the South Center, which is in Geneva, funded by third world governments, and especially Third World Network, the most professional, most effective, most powerful, analytical, and critical thinking you really find in this whole terrain. But really interesting debates about whether those forces are still pushing too hard to defend something, the Kyoto Protocol, that is so weak on its original goals, 5% from 1990 to 2012, and is so profoundly based on carbon trading that maybe it just should go away. But its defense of Kyoto and its binding agreements, that's very important. Another argument that comes here in New York from the UN Department of Economic and Social Affairs, some of you may know Jomo KS, who's an extraordinary Malaysian political economist, writes 2 or 3 books a year, top-notch, really great thinker. But their argument about what climate justice represents is more or less like a need to industrialize by the South, and that sort of is the emphasis of what justice would be, to give more of the tiny available space left for CO2 emissions to the South. A third orientation that I consider, again, less than optimal is to get greenhouse development rights, GDRs, set out in Heinrich Böll-Stiftung, the German Greens, and Eco-Equity from Berkeley, Tom Athanasiou, Paul Baer, have argued that we should just do per capita rights, and so that everybody has a right to pollute, and then you can sell your rights to the highest bidder. So it gets us back to carbon trading, and so that technique's a little dubious. And then I've just been having this debate with Mary Robinson, her staff actually, about whether her call for climate justice to be augmented by a global carbon market and regional markets is appropriate. The Mary Robinson Foundation for Climate Justice, that was a speech she gave at the Libyan School of Economics in London. I mean, the London School but that whole sort of strategy to fuse global markets with our CJ traditions is what Robinson, with her elite gaze, is trying to do. And she is very, very powerful and effective, and she's been working with big corporations all around and has a very high profile. And the UN even was ready to give her a big role as the sort of main rep to civil society. As I said, the last time she was in Durban, which was in 2001, it wasn't so happy. She walked out of the UN the alternative summit of the UN, the NGO summit, because of the demands that were coming from the NGOs, and it was a very uncomfortable time. I have some clips of it if anybody wants to see. And then we have some in the CJ movement who have endorsed RED, the Reducing Emissions Through Deforestation and Forest Degradation strategy. And some indigenous movements are getting some money out of this, and it's a very complicated and difficult process where critics like the Indigenous Environmental Network say that's just selling out. And others are saying, no, we're just taking some money, but they owe us that anyway, and we are the best stewards, and so we got to play this game. Even though the 3 main demands by those who would, in the CJ movement, argue for RED to be reformed, namely free, prior, and informed consent, so that indigenous people are not harmed. Secondly, that trees are trees, not industrial monocultural timber plantations, right? Those would be disqualified. And third, that the REDD projects stay out of the carbon market and offsets. Those three are the kind of demands that progressive reformers in the CJ movement have been making to improve REDD. And I don't think they're going to win any one of them. So I don't think the balance of forces is such that, unless some of you have better information, there's any chance at all. So I think we're back to a definition and a politics of climate justice that's based on the Cochabamba demands, 50% greenhouse gas emissions reduction by 2017, climate debt paid, like big money involves 6% of GDP, full respect for human rights of indigenous people, and of Mother Nature, the sort of rights of nature argument coming up here strongly. The International Court of Climate Justice as a vehicle to punish the US and others that are going to violate these, the rejection of carbon markets, including the REDD, the forestry, changes in consumption patterns, and the intellectual property rights on climate-related technology. So those, to me, are the logical core arguments that the CJ movement has gotten behind. And there may be a little bit of nuance here and there in this, but this is, to me, where we're about. Where I think it's now, it's looking really good in some ways, because we have such extraordinary sites of struggle in local contexts, like the Niger Delta, where Environmental Rights Action is a group led by Nemo Bassi of Friends of the Earth International. He's the chair of that organization. He just won the Right Livelihood Award last year. And so the argument is not in my backyard for the Niger Delta and oil, but also not in the planet's backyard. And so they've done an exceptional job at beginning to introduce an overall rejection of oil exploration in that very crucial site, in the tradition of Ken Saro-Wiwa, the women who would take off their clothes to prevent Nigerian workers from going into those shell plants. Of course, you could argue that the movement for the emancipation of the Niger Delta's big military operation, their kidnapping of foreign oil workers, was really responsible for keeping the oil in the soil. About 80% at one point in 2008 could not be taken out. So there's interesting strategy, tactic, and ideology debates going on there. I think the major project we would look at as a model for keeping oil in the soil would be the Yasuni Park in Ecuador, where Acción Ecológica from Quito and CONAI, the indigenous people's movement, have been very vociferous at telling Rafael Correa, the president of Ecuador, leave that oil in the soil. And it's a very contested terrain where Correa has a sort of, what you call maybe petro-Keynesian, like Chavez petro-socialist, or Morales petro-indigenous sort of orientation to development. And so it's a very interesting challenge for those activists who operate under a lot of stress in Ecuador to make this Yasuni Park project real. And they thought they had good allies in the Germans and the Norwegians, who initially put down some money, like $50 million a year, to serve as a bit of a down payment. But that's been contested because those two countries also want to get the carbon markets going, and they're hoping that the UNDP would take in Yasuni and then package it for the carbon markets. And some of Correa's staff want to do that as well. So there are a lot of complications when you get into all the details, but I think it's gratifying when you see places like Britain, where climate camp and this struggle to block this big Corrigan oil refinery and the power plants and Heathrow generated enough fear by the establishment that MI5 infiltrated a guy into their ranks for 7 years and actually gave him a lot of money to fund activities. So he was actually a provocateur in that sense, and therefore when they went to court earlier this year, the case was tossed out because the guy got Stockholm syndrome. His name was, I think it was Mark Stone, is that right? Anybody? Mark's, anyway, so he kind of went with the activists, and they didn't have a case. And that's also the sort of situation where really brave, committed direct action activists like the Rising Tide in Australia, and in Norway they were able to get a place called Lofoten to be deemed off limits for oil exploration this year. And in Canada, of course, the tar sands. And I think in the US, there's actually amazing untold stories of community struggles and environmental struggles against coal. Sierra Club has helped on the legal front, but these micro struggles that have stopped about 150 coal-fired power plants in Dick Cheney's original sort of energy strategy from being built. That's one of the really heroic activities. And then push back on big coal in the Navajo lands of the Black Mesa and struggles in Peabody territory. And then prevention of incineration, and that Detroit incinerator, the biggest in the US, was stopped last year. And there's a really wonderful group, Global Alliance for Incinerator Alternatives, in Berkeley that's pushing that. And the Berkeley struggle, the Richmond, California struggles against Chevron, very inspiring to stop the expansion, and struggles against big hydro, and then also positive struggles. I have Oakland there, but I know Oakland's a tough town as of last week. But they actually had a very strong climate action proposal to turn Oakland into a post-carbon city. So I think there's so much out there that's just a tiny scratching of the surface. I mean, there's a big movement around the world against coal. And Ted Nace has done a wonderful job in documenting this too. So lots of these things are happening. So finally, to wrap up, what's going to happen in Durban? How many of you are coming to Durban? Only 2 in the room. Well, maybe we'll just skip through this and we can go and have a beer a little later and tell you more about it. But it should be, I'll give you that real sense of the finer details. But I think you're going to see, if you're watching Durban, these targets of activists pop up, and there will be so many interesting creative things that will be happening. In part because Durban 100 years ago hosted the origination of a wonderful concept, Satyagraha, when Mahatma Gandhi actually practiced the idea before he took it back home to India and kicked out the British Empire. And he did so in a place called Phoenix, and in this settlement, just in the northern part of Durban, we have a wonderful sort of shrine to Gandhi and his ideas. So I think that sense of the truth force and people putting themselves on the line, the way in this country, in the White House, in early September, they were able to do the 1,250 arrests. And those are the sorts of struggles I think we're going to be seeing, with wonderful traditions as well from South Africa's own anti-apartheid struggle being brought up to date in the struggle against climate apartheid. So I'd love to hear what you all think about whether the analysis and the politics sound sensible. But you know, if not too many of you have been to Durban or going, it may seem a little far afield. So it'd be much more valuable for me as well to hear what you think's going on in your neck of the woods. And why, after that Copenhagen struggle that had 100,000 people showing up in Copenhagen to get the message out, and with NGOs saying, no, we have to do it this year, tick, 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 seal the deal, and failing miserably, and then the sort of interest in the climate waning away, and maybe here in New York, this lovely small group of intimate people here, it's just one reflection instead of thousands of people hearing what I have to say, of how the climate movement has faded from our screens as the big economic justice questions have reemerged. So how do we get them back together? How do we connect the dots and make sure everyone knows that this biggest threat to humanity's future is something like the WTO in 1999? Does everybody remember back then? That everybody could get involved in. It was the sort of target that everyone had a stake in, right? Everyone from democracy activists, feminists, trade unionists, community activists, environmentalists, and that's the sense I have that climate really could be. And what we hope we can do in Durban, and I think I can speak for all the kind of climate justice crowd in Durban and all those that will come in and join us, is to help revive this movement and put the spotlight on the CJ struggles, because frankly, in the UNFCCC itself, inside the International Convention Center, it's dead space. So we'll see what we can do to make sure everyone knows how alive we are outside. So thanks.
Great. So why don't we take questions or observations for Patrick?
Tell us your name and your organization.
Hi, I'm Annie Wilson, and I live in New York City, and I've been closing live hydro reports in Canada for 20 years. I'm seen mostly, and I chair the energy committee for the Sierra Club. But I guess I missed the beginning of the presentation, apologize for my lateness, but did you cover the $100 million of the International Finance Corporation for offsets as renewable energy non-goal that are being developed?
Yeah.
And that could be an action item, like in Durban possibly?
Yeah, we've got a lot of good Sierra people who are in the back who can help us on this. But yeah, let's take that as one good example. Let's collect a few. Would that be good? A few questions, a few points. Your name is?
Cindy. I'm a writer, journalist, and also an advocate and member of various human rights organizations, but also science organizations. And this is a subject that is, of course, is affecting the entire world, and that's earthquakes, and natural disasters, and then, of course, what happened in Fukushima. And in lieu of carbon-based fuels, are countries turning to the nuclear, and it's been called clean energy. What do you think of the conflict?
Others?
Could you say a little bit more in the South African context about why you feel that both COSATU and the SACP have been so relatively unwilling to support the strategies that we're talking about?
Yeah, good. And just again, your name is?
I'm John Wright. I'm from Oxford. I'm visiting New York at the moment.
Well, that's a good way to start. And I think, Mandy, I don't know that $100 million fund in particular, but I know that the World Bank brought a whole bunch of those, like how many, Michael, did they bring? About 4 or 5 in the September 19 memo that they wrote to the G20, in which a lot of boosting of offsets and carbon markets was proposed as a way to inject money into this Green Climate Fund. So you can kind of look at that memo as, I'd say, as a sort of last-ditch attempt. And although everything was overshadowed by Greece, maybe some of you in the room, do you know, did the World Bank come out of Cannes with confidence that what they wanted, that is a new infusion of funds, would be given them? I'm not sure if you feel this is actually something that's going to really start taking off, or whether, like so many of the other bank and IFC initiatives in carbon markets, it's another dozen. I mean, the huge subsidies that go into the attempts to make financial markets rational. And as I said I would say at the outset, there's a kind of theoretical argument I would be basing this on, which is that a lot of the carbon market activity reflects overall capitalist crisis displacement. The idea that you could even get $3 trillion in carbon trading by 2020, that was widely accepted until about 3 years ago. And what happened was in 2008, peaking at about $140 billion a year, the carbon markets just couldn't pretend any longer that there was anything real. And it's partly because they had so much fraud and corruption internally. Just one reflection of that is that they had to close the main market, the European Union emissions trading scheme this year, because hackers were able to steal the Austrian government and the Czech government's CERs, the Certified Emissions Reductions credits. And then actually, you didn't know if anything you were trading would be shown up somewhere that somebody owned it, and you'd actually have a worthless, stolen goods, basically. So when the main evaluators from the United Nations have to be disqualified for systematic corruption, when the Hungarian government resells the same credits, which they did in 2010, when the price of the carbon goes wacky, I mean, it's been up at 33 euros a ton and down to 7 last week, I think it was at its peak, but it's had like 6 major crashes. So it was once the most hoped for commodity in the world, and now I think everyone says it's the worst performing commodity, a ton of carbon. So my sense is this attempt to boost with 100 million here or a bit there isn't going to work, and their only hope is to find 50 billion a year of state funds in a sense to augment, and that would be the Green Climate Fund. And that's what I think might be one of the worst case outcomes of Durban, is if indeed on the revenue side, the proposal by Nick Stern of England, the economist who was a World Bank chief economist, and Trevor Manuel, that at least half the carbon market revenues in the Green Climate Fund then be boosted in turn by state funding. We're talking about yet another bailout. One of the most evocative critiques of this is from Matt Taibbi when he did this critique of Goldman Sachs a couple of years ago. It was so strong that if you just go back and read about, what was he call it, a gigantic octopus squid or something, and he really said, okay, well, here's the next piece that they want to do, which is carbon trading. So I think the Sierra Club's been generally good on the critique of World Bank projects, especially when we've worked with the national office in the US. But I think it's been a little bit weak in understanding that carbon trading simply can't be reformed. So I would say to Mike Brune, head at, like, maybe Sierra Club should join Friends of the Earth International and get with the critique of carbon markets as another false solution. That'd be my, working very closely with Sierra and all sorts of other things, but saying, well, on that front, they've made a big mistake.
Well, I could possibly inform you that, there was a lawsuit in California, and there's going to be implementation of carbon trading there. There's the development of the Western Climate Initiative, which includes promises in Canada. You have the Northeast Regional Gas, that is a complete, there'll be no reductions. They projected to cap to levels that we thought back in 2017. So in any case, from the overview, and this here club required and overruled our New York position opposing the climate change and climate trade, by the way. And we're
Carbon
at
trade.
it
You were in New York or
Yes.
against it and
Yeah,
national?
absolutely, yes.
Was that very recently or a few
2 years ago, they tried to they overruled and required that we support regional greenhouse gas initiatives that we didn't.
Yeah, we'll keep
And
fighting.
we've been fighting. We had another round this summer with the Goldman Sachs guy, but let's put that on hold right now in New York. But I guess what I want to agree with, so your information was going to take place is now they're going to have 3 standards of offsets. And California and the Western Climate Initiative are going to be including Mexico and Canada for the offsets. That is, it's going to end up in a lawsuit with the interstate commerce clause, and there's going to be backdoor regulation from the federal government to establish a uniform regs across the U.S. That's the most possible scenario from folks I've been speaking to recently, so I'm just kind of putting it out there. Probably wrong, but I might not be wrong, so I don't know.
Well, no, that's exactly the right discussions we should all be having, like how big a threat is this? And
Enormous. They're not quitting. I think they're...
yeah, the critique from California, I had my sabbatical last year in Berkeley, especially around environmental racism, is very, very sound, very solid because of the way the emitters will continue to keep old plants in communities of color open. And I think Bill Vallejo at the Communities for a Better Environment in LA has been still leading that critique, and I'm sure working closely with the Sierra folks.
Lost the lawsuit. They have to appeal now.
Yeah, but it's a very good terrain of struggle, and people around the world are watching it, and the extent to which carbon trading then has that blowback effect, not just in enclosure processes in the third world, but then keeping first world or sites like in LA around. That's very important. I think the best news is that Chicago, the main national exchange, has died, and so I don't see it coming up anymore. There's no legislative opportunity for carbon traders to push any new bills around climate, as far as I can tell.
They were bought out. They've been consolidated with the Beijing and London exchange. It's one. I'm trying to remember it's actually a fossil fuel consortium that bought them out. It's IPM.
Yeah, well, none of that seems to be going anywhere. And I mean, the best indication, Michael Dorsey and I were at the IETA, the International Emissions Trading Association event last December in Cancun, the side event. And Michael, you'd agree, they were pretty much as down and depressed as those of us on the left are typically are. So they just didn't have any kind of market opportunity.
The private money is running away from this. I mean, that's why the price has been falling the past two quarters. And because there's uncertainty, and I'd say the private capital splits. I mean, half of them, well, they're not split. Half of them think it's garbage and aren't interested. And the other half know it's garbage, but they're looking for arbitrage opportunities.
And looking for a white knight like the World Bank to come in and
to cover them. But most people will tell you.
Seems like it's the offsets portion that's taken off.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's watch that space, and if you think in Durban we've got to raise some warnings and target some of the specific players there, and if you think some of them should be on our deck of playing cards, please do let me know. I'll give everybody my card if you'd like. With all of that discussion on my favorite topic, carbon markets, I just forgot, you're Mandy, right?
Annie.
You're Annie, okay, and your name again is?
Cindy.
Cindy, just very quickly, what did you ask? So sorry. I know the third question.
Nukes.
Oh, about nukes, yeah. I have so little to say. I mean, one of my favorite writers, George Monbiot, gets a little mad after Fukushima, just endorses nukes even more. Just shake your head. The most advanced, technologically, sophisticated society in the world can't run these things. The danger is so formidable. And I think, although South Africa has a new plan to do 1 trillion rand, which is about $150 billion worth of new nukes, I don't think they're going to get off the ground because this danger level is so high. But I'd love to hear where you think the struggle against nukes is going to go. To us, the single biggest problem in Monbiot's argument is his failure to look at the abuse of of energy, the waste of energy in all kinds of capitalist production and distribution and the exchange, which we could do away with if we really had to, if we had no nuclear and had to scale back the greenhouse gas-based energy right away. And then just to address quickly COSATU, the Communist Party is very easy because they don't really take any kind of position. And they're much more loyal right now than I think they've ever been, because their candidate, Jacob Zuma, is the president, and they have their top two people. One is the Minister of Higher Education, Bladen Zamanti, the other is the Deputy Minister of Transport, Jeremy Cronin. So they're really locked into loyalty to the ANC, and they've said pretty much nothing about climate. So we can maybe leave them aside, but most excitingly, there are very strong groups within COSATU that are endorsing the million climate jobs. The National Union of Metal Workers of South Africa, the South African Transport and Allied Workers Union, and the South African Municipal Workers Union are the three biggest. There's another one, the National Education, Health and Allied Workers Union. So those three, maybe four, are the core solid group. And COSATU as a federation has gotten behind it. Now this is terribly important for the reasons you said. Those groups that are, those center-left forces, normally allied within the ANC, the alliance they call it, rarely connect with independent left, with community movements, social movements, and environmentalists. And this time they will, and they'll be part of the big December 3rd March, Global Day of Action, and they'll also be holding their events with the People's Space at our University of Kwazulu-Natal. So I'm really hopeful, actually, and I'm incredibly impressed with one union that I know quite well, the metal workers, that they're willing to make the case that a post-fossil fuel society in sectors they are most vulnerable in, autos, steel and smelting, can be transformed, and that they can be the vanguard of the solar hot water heaters, of turbines for wind and for tidal power. And so we're really setting a potential breakthrough with very, very good leadership in the metal workers to really keep an eye on. So I'd be very actually enthusiastic for the first time since I moved to South Africa in 1990 that we'll really see Labour and the independent left in unity. Continue? Others?
I have a question. You talked about Copenhagen and what a sort of global uprising there was. What kind of civil society organizations are coming to Durban from around the world, and how have you been trying to coordinate?
Well, the geography is much harder than Copenhagen, where 100,000 marched, or Cancun, which ended up being very fragmented with different ideological forces in Mexico and internationally, finding themselves geographically in disparate places and at very, very long geographical and temporal distances. It was very hard to get anything together. I think the biggest march was probably Vietnam Messina with about 5,000. So it wasn't a successful counter summit scene by all accounts. So we've taken a decision early on that all of our notorious sectarian differences and splits and all will be left outside the climate door, and that there's a C17. It's so big, the committee of 17, that you even got WWF in this big committee with socialist groups. So it's a very big committee. And about midway through the process in July, a very interesting experience for everyone occurred in which the C17 tried to come up with demands. And they went in with 26 proposals. And the methodology was, if you don't like these, just tell us, we'll just check it out. So we ended up with 4 banal demands. So everybody kind of said, maybe we shouldn't actually do any politics. And all the C17 should do is make a logistical scene. And I think that's actually one of the most interesting and maybe hopeful versions of international hosting. We're not seeing fragmentation. We're not seeing old grudges and ideological splits. Usually the splits are socialists and autonomous on the independent left, and between the independent left and the center left, and between all of those forces and the big NGOs. We will definitely see, even yesterday we saw Greenpeace do a major hit occupying Kusile, the construction site. So we will definitely see big NGOs out to brand, to increase their brand value with lots of media attention without any reference to local processes. Greenpeace, even though they have an international leader, is a really great guy, a guy called Kumi Naidu from Durban, who's come around and said, what can we do to support? All the indications are that that's not going to happen. But notwithstanding that, it's like let 1,000 flowers bloom, because the C-17 people space will be a safe space and you can all wander in and out. It's actually, as of last Friday, they just moved it to our university, the University of Kwazulu-Natal. And I think it's going to be a great event because it will mean a big, big march on the 3rd. We aren't unlike other places like Oakland, bothered too much by people who wear masks and call themselves a black bloc. We've never ever seen that stuff. So it'll be quite a big, maybe 30,000, 40,000 will come out, and hopefully we'll get the permission to end on the beach for a going away party. Going away party? Yeah, the rising water, right? And the idea is that this is the most democratic and popular place, probably in all of South Africa, the Durban beach, and it's about 4 blocks from the ICC. And one idea is to just walk by that ICC in mourning, in quiet, dignified, angry silence, that whole UN process is useless, it's dead. Another is to take this funny little instrument you probably heard of, right? It's called a vuvuzela. I could really do it loudly, but I don't think you want to hear that. You heard enough of it about a year and a half ago at the World Cup. And those vuvuzelas might be blowing pretty loud when they pass the ICC and the US consulate and the City Hall. So we're still in a big struggle over the march route. And I just think it'll be a great event because who's going to object to going out to the beach? This isn't anything really that's going to threaten anyone. But then the question for us is whether we've mobilized enough consciousness to take the buses out to those various places I showed you up and down the coast, especially the South Durban, and start doing blockades. And then whether our Durban police learn from, who was it, Tony Baloney, what was his name? Anthony Baloney. Anyway, so learn how not to treat ordinary non-violent civil disobedient activists. So that's one of our challenges the next couple of weeks, to firm up some sort of procedure by which our visitors, and you ask who they will be, will at least be arrested and charged and paying a small fine and released on the spot, or in some quick and dirty 24/7 jail where we have for the World Cup without any time in our awful real jails. So it's our 24/7 court system. Who will be coming, actually asked, because he's coming, Michael's coming. We probably will have 400 or 500 like yourselves. That's what we're picking up on the CJ list. Is that a good estimate?
More than that.
More than that from the CJ crowd outside of Africa. Now, inside Africa, we have an excellent effort by Pan-African Climate Justice Alliance, PACJA, to have a caravan that started today, started today in Burundi. And it's actually going from Burundi to Rwanda and Uganda, and then Kenya and Tanzania, Malawi, Zambia, Zimbabwe, Botswana, South Africa. And another group led by Via Campesina will take buses from Mozambique, the strongest Via site in Africa. And that way I know at least, because we're doing the betting, 1,000 activists from the continent will be there. How sophisticated and militant they are, we're not too sure, because there's terrible unevenness. We have lots of NGOs that took the late Wangari Maathai's route of trying to do tree planting and getting RED or CDM money, so there's sort of that tradition is built into some of the NGOs. But I think from what I've seen at PACJA that they're really good on these issues and really together. And we're going to see on the 27th, Sunday, a huge rally, maybe 20,000, 30,000, led by Archbishop Desmond Tutu with Bono and Pope and, the whole kind of crowd that comes along. I think I have a newspaper article from last Sunday that shows the stars, Brad and Andrew, all of the kind of characters who are going to be parachuting in. So that should get the tens of thousands out just to stare at the stars. But then the question of that march and that rally is called We Have Faith. And we probably would be now saying that we have faith in the people, but 16 times, we don't really have very much faith in this UNFCCC, this Conference of Polluters. So there'll be a little bit of that debating going on. In fact, I think our university is the best place for this because there will be so many vibrant debates. We're going to be doing teach-ins from 7 p.m. to midnight every night, and we're going to be doing 1 or 2 of them. And Michael is one of the people who is helping Alejandro Nadal and myself organize those. So I'm sure we're going to have a really good experience and build movement in a place, as I say, in South Africa, where we've had a fairly low consciousness and a lot of militant anger at the base, but not very much, connecting these thoughts. Any advice you have on how you do it here? how you get an Occupy Wall Street movement that actually picks up the environment. Has anybody been down to the US during any of the environmental events? Do you want to tell us about what your experiences there are? Do you think talking about the 1% and the 99 works on the environment in that kind of context? Carbon trading is the logical link.
I was supposed to be there last weekend, I had to go to some other job, but I wanted to raise the carbon trading issue in a fairly, there might have been some discussion about it. It had it off site in the location.
I know one of Michael's old friends, Kenny Bruno, who used to run Corp Watch, has been one of the sort of educators in the Occupy movement. But I don't know, what are you getting as lessons from that? And getting incredible mainstream support for a movement that, when I lived here until June, I didn't think would come up so quickly. So,
I think there's building labor support, and so that has been increasingly involved. There's been a lot of donations. And that march was 30,000 people. I think it's the labor influence is going to be built.
Yeah.
That's what I think.
well, that's what we're hoping for in South Africa too. And targeting these fat cats and a kind of, I suppose, a populist language that doesn't have to be automatically translated into techie reformism, right? And I suppose we've been trying to figure out what kind of reforms should be argued for, and that's why that Cochabamba list of demands is so wonderful. They're very, very transformative demands. They're not demands that are going to be met anytime soon by the UNFCCC, but if they were met, they would be really non-reformist reforms. They would be structurally so powerful they'd undermine the existing laws of motion of the system. And most importantly, they would give us more momentum in demanding more reforms and more transformative kind of politics. And I contrast that with the kind of reforms that have been out in mainstream US environmentalism, and I talk about this in the new book of Politics of Climate Justice. Reforms. I'm using, by the way, the dichotomy that Andre Gortz, Boris Kargalitsky, John Saul, a few others have been developing on movement strategy, in which reforms fit internally to the logic of the system and have the effect of co-opting the movement that argues for the reforms, and thus the reforms strengthen the system and its laws of motion. So I think those are the next set of problems when we do get to the point where we can challenge for power. And the most important site I've thought has been the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, because in some cases, like the West Virginia mountaintop removal, did anybody follow that in December, January? There was a banning of some of the major projects there. I forgot the names of the companies, but using the Clean Water Act, Lisa Jackson, the EPA administrator, was actually able to increase the momentum and the strength of the activists in West Virginia to give them the confidence to move to the next round. I'm sure Barack Obama took that away when he, in early September, broke the hearts of Bill McKibben and all those 350 folks who were sitting out at the White House and said, no, we're not going to actually enforce our ozone-related potential climate-saving strategies. So I think that might be one of the most exciting spaces. So when we were saying Washington-free Durban, Zellick, don't come, Todd Stern, stay home. There may be a little space for Lisa Jackson as an exception there. But that's only dependent upon how much you guys struggle, especially in fracking. Is there anything from your movement in New York State against fracking?
Bill McKibben isn't sure about gas. He hasn't made a decision. He spoke with a colleague of mine 3 weeks ago and said he wasn't sure.
Well,
so maybe if you have personal connections to him, you might want him to take.
We won't let him leave Durban until he comes up with the right plan.
Okay.
Are there good fracking examples in it?
I don't have fracking examples.
Okay, what's your...
Well, I think that some of the graphics that you showed us, I know that the graphics that we used in Mexico were really powerful, and they really, at least in the areas around what's going on, as much as they could, like hotels for the children in the area, putting up graphics, about what the movement was about, and about especially the anti-cop people that were in Mexico. And I think that those graphics, as much as we can, get them in people's view here, everywhere.
Well, great. And tell us your name, and are you with them?
I'm sorry, my name is Tamar, and I'm a media activist.
Well, come on down. I mean, we have a very underdeveloped crowd in Durban, and our top 7 graffiti artists were all arrested and given huge sentences about 3 months ago. I think the city manager had that sense that we were going to decorate the town. And so he really made a big splash about the seven. Now the seven are out of jail, and their highest profile artist is a guy called Ewok, whose real name is Ian Robinson. But you'll probably hear more about him because the last few days he's been identifying, put a call out, which walls can we paint? And especially with that beautiful graphic that was given us by Axiom Ecologica, you'll see a lot of that around, and a lot of that cop vultures. And the other theme that's just coming up that I think our media folks are really going to work with would be the clown. And that is the baobab looking like more of a court jester. And the 52 deck of playing cards, like your Robert Zoellick having some face paint and things like that. So I think we'll be seeing those kinds of themes that will make it more fun and interesting all around as well. And then we've even got some lessons going right now in reverse graffiti to clean a very sooty city in particular ways where you can just clean some space without it being official graffiti or law-breaking graffiti. You just clean it and it shows up with your message. So I think we'll get going on it. We have some terrific people from Britain and the States. So if you've got some ideas, let's get onto some Skype discussions with you. I'm interested you say Cancun. I wandered around and certainly saw the Mexican anarchists doing lots of interesting graffiti, but I didn't see that many murals, so we need to see what you've got there.
Well, I think just the culture of, using that type of propaganda to get messages out, because they know that it's not coming from any other places. And I think that with the Occupy stuff right now, as far as, having it be a global thing, I think in the US, what really sent waves around was the Decolonize Wall Street poster that was made, and I think so if we can draw some kind of connections with, some of the language that's there and bring it back, then I think people here will digest it a little bit better.
Good. Well, does conference at polluters work as a
Right.
That's the sort of, because nobody knows what this COP means.
No.
This is COP.
Conference of the parties.
So other ideas and other feedback I can provide to our people back home?
International shipping industry, unregulated, no emission regulations, what's going on with that? That would be a big movie, because labor is connected with all of this disparity.
Yeah, and that's Satao. And don't forget the Durban docks, 1973 is where the modern trade union movement came from, and it is the biggest dock, harbor in Africa. And on occasion, like last May, just before the World Cup, in order to get a better wage deal from the state-owned shipping ports company, the Satao activists went on strike for 3 weeks, and you could see 150 ships out in the harbor, out going out to sea, just locked it out there, and that was like this union muscle that you could really feel. Satao won't go to bat on climate like that, and to get Satao to move from promotion of trucking to a rail-based system, which will be part and parcel of that kind of debate with labor. How do we get a much cleaner system of even within capitalism? How do you green, because trucking is the most inefficient and chaotic, and shipping as well, with so many empty boats coming out, 5,000 containers on the new post-Panamax ships that they've dug the harbor very deep for, and then they just go back with nothing. They come from China, and they go back with maybe some.
Is there no emission regulations?
No, it's the worst. Yeah.
So how can that get on the table?
Well, I think that's on the table through the. I don't know if the G20 moved on. They moved a little bit on financial transactions tax, but that was the next one that they were going to pick up as a source of fund, the big shipping tax. Does anybody know the status of that within the G20 and those elites? So it's out there as a discussion point, but frankly, as activists, we haven't found ways to block that harbor. Maybe Greenpeace will. They're not going to bring Rainbow Warrior, but maybe we should get out and do something. I think the activists are in discussion about what that port represents, and hopefully it'll be community, labor, and environment together in a discussion about what to do there. But you may not get that on this occasion. There may be another period in which Durban rises again. South Durban is probably the site where most of the serious activism will be because of this fossil fuel sector that keeps blowing up on us. So I hope you keep a good eye on the internet, and maybe we'll even get into the TV, but the main thing is on December 3rd, do you have a beach that you would hate to say bye-bye to, Coney Island or somewhere like that? You can go out there and be in solidarity with our beach party. or do something in New York. Has anybody heard whether December 3rd is a date people would call for? I gather December 10th is an Occupy date on environment. Does anybody know that? So people were describing it in Washington yesterday, a discussion in which maybe it can be moved up a week to coincide with the big global struggle to put attention to Durban.
Who remembers when Earth Day is? Does anybody remember?
It's April 22nd, I believe, is that right?
Yeah.
So,
I
yeah.
have a question, just again, like structurally in urban, but how is it, you said that there is a space that everybody's kind of coming together, so it's not gonna be,
Not
I
like
guess it's
Cancun.
fragmented, right? Because in Mexico it really was.
Since two of you are coming, but now maybe tomorrow you're going to be the third in the house to join us. Let's just quickly show you what the space will look like. It's in terms of the city. This is the ICC, the convention center, and we are having what's called a climate refugee camp for about 3,000-4,000 people who are coming in by bus and train on the 2nd, 3rd, 4th. So that's going to be a big site, just big marquee tents, and people just roll up bags. And luckily Durban's so nice and warm, you don't need to bring a big blanket. And we're about 10 minutes away in the people space. Originally, we were supposed to have people space there, which would be a lot better, but the university charged way too much, so we've just taken that over as of Friday. So it'll be fairly accessible. We'll try to have, unlike Cancun, 10 minutes, not an hour and a half, and there won't be any moon palace or any of the places in between that would slow people down. And this is what it'll look like downtown. And we've been given one protest site just next to the convention center, but Hilton is where the heads of state stay. And this kind of whole block here will be carved out as a no-go zone. But we'll be able to put, that basically can fit about 500. So specialized protests will be in the speaker's corner. And then on the campus itself, my office, we, for whatever reason, our Center for Civil Society has the top floor and the highest building in Durban. So I don't know if we're going to hold it after this, but anyway, so that's the Memorial Tower building, which probably will be called CJ Tower. And then we'll have a few other sites that will be ours, and about 1,000 dorm rooms all around here. So it'll be really nice. It is, unfortunately, this is the bourgeois university of Durban. This is the site where the ruling class kids would be reproduced. And in the old days, whites, but and it's in a very posh area. But we're hoping we'll just have a free access to any proletarians and women who would wander through our gates, which would be much easier in the other place because it's right next to the big transport hub. So we do have a lot of struggle to liberate this space and to make it as open and welcoming as we can possibly make it, and hopefully have 10,000 people wandering through here. We've been able to get very good sites, free use of pretty much the Wi-Fi and the video projectors, all that sort of thing. But I'm very worried about translation because we just are ill-equipped on isiZulu, the local language, and there's so many difficulties in that sort of translation challenge, as well as Portuguese. You'll have lots of Mozambicans, and French for the Francophone Africans, and Spanish for our Latin America. So we're really going to be struggling on that front. So anyway, that'll be what our alternative space will look like. So it'll be a lot different than Klima Forum, which was a sort of NGO zone, and the climate justice activists wanted to go to Christiania, the sort of bohemian site in Copenhagen. And it'll be more centralized than that fragmented and politically disparate Cancun experience. And I hope we'll have enough wonderful debates and this teaching process and really keep a great sense of spirit and interest and alternative events and displays of all the attempts we were going to be making to do post-carbon activities. So it won't just be negative, but it will be a site where we can really see the new society. And Ubuntu be the sense in African culture, you are who you are through others, and the connection to rights of nature through that philosophy is also one of the innovations we're hoping for. So that, I hope, gives you a sense, everyone. We can go out and have a drink later on the route down to Occupy Wall Street or wherever you want to go. That Durban's going to be a very good place. And we won't play the rest of the film now, but it's called Story of Cap and Trade. So if you have a look at it and you think we should be doing anything to improve it for the last couple of weeks before we do all the educational work, do let them know. But thanks so much for coming through and sharing all your ideas and listening to me. We'll see you again.